although Richard's a little off, not playing with quite a full deck, I think. He makes it fun.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
Ross Alhambra intersection at 15000. Contact Los Angeles Center, 2 minutes northeast of the stadium.
Welcome to episode 8 of my Weird Record Collection. I'm Sean, and I'm coming to you from Chicago, inviting you into my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. This episode will feature, for the first time in this podcast's admittedly short history, an album on a mainstream label from a mainstream artist. We pay tribute to the late, great Richard Simmons by taking a look at the only album of original material he ever released, Reach. And by the way, something that I usually do when I record during hot days or really super cold days, I like to turn off the air conditioning or heating during my recording session. Well, I'm not doing that right now, and I'll tell you why. It's because, not quite a week ago, my wife and I woke up and we felt really, really warm. The air conditioner was on, but it was warm, and we found out, it was not producing any cool air. The thermometer in the room confirmed that it got warmer. So, landlord sent the HVAC guy over to look at it. He said, yep, your compressor's shot. Now, the thing is, we've been having trouble with this air conditioner for several years. Every summer, every year, they had to come out and recharge the air conditioner, had to put Freon in it and everything. And the guy said, look, this air conditioner needs to be replaced, or else this has to happen every single year. Landlord said, nope, not replacing it. Yet at the same time, he would also complain every year when he'd get the bill to fix the air conditioner. Don't get me wrong, I like the landlord. He's a good guy. He's a good landlord. He just has a few quirks, and that's one of them. But, the HVAC guy came, said, the compressor's shot, so we're going to see what's going to happen. Chances are that whole thing's going to need to be replaced. And we're both thinking, yes! Because we think it's the original air conditioner from when the landlord renovated the building in 1990. So, turns out, whole thing had to come out and be replaced. And it's been pretty hot here in Chicago for the last several days. It's been in the 90s, very humid. I want my air conditioning, so I am not turning it off. So if you hear it in the background, well, sorry, not sorry. But anyway, I wanted to address some listener feedback. In the previous episode, episode 7, I talked about a record called Everything You Need to Know to Operate a CB Radio. Now, here's the thing. When you use a CB, it's very common for people to use handles or nicknames. Well, that tradition continued into the electronic age, of course, and is in use by the person who sent me this feedback, who goes by the handle Malicious Carp. Malicious Carp says, I am in the Xennial range, too young to be Gen X, too old to be a millennial. I missed the CB fad, but in the mid to late 90s, I had one in my pickup truck. Groups of people would play CB tag, that is, drop hints about your location and see who finds you first. I would also listen for my friends. A few of them were into off-roading and occasionally needed a tug out of the mud. I had a big 4x4, and I mounted the CB in the headliner, like in a semi-truck, and that made me feel cool. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the section on why people listen to records. I did have a small record collection when I was a kid, along with cassette tapes and CDs. When I moved out to go to state college after a few years at community college, I abandoned most of my physical media at my parents' house. They were thrilled about that, and most of it got tossed or sold off when I was done with college and decided that I didn't really have a use for it. I had poorly ripped all of my CDs to very low-quality MP3s by then, and was convinced that I didn't need anything else. Now that I'm in my mid-40s, I am chasing every avenue that I can to attempt to recapture fleeting feelings of my youth. Part of that was getting a record player and a small collection of records. My main focus is records that I had when I was a kid and new records that are interesting to listen to as an album rather than a collection of singles. The thing that hit me right away when I started listening to records again was that I found myself actually paying attention to the music instead of having it as background noise for whatever else I was doing. That is the main thing that keeps me listening to records instead of listening someplace else. Thanks for the fun episode. Well, thank you, Malicious Carp. Thank you for writing. And if you care to write in, please listen to the closing part of the podcast for the various ways you can connect with me. Now, I wanted to respond especially to this thing that Malicious Carp said when he said, playing CB tag, drop hints about your location and see who finds you first. Now, in the previous episode, I talked about that road trip that I was on with my parents, and the car broke down, the car that we'd borrowed from our neighbors at their request. And there was a CB in the car. And I remember that my mother was saying that she had heard that the one thing you do not ever want to do on a CB is give any hints as to where you are. Like, don't say what your car looks like because you do not want to be found. And I guess that's just more of a security thing, just so people don't find you and do whatever they want to do with you, whatever that is. So I don't know, was CB tag really a safe thing? Well, obviously it was. Malicious Carp is still here. He was able to contact me. So, oh, and speaking of that car trip, I asked my mother, I remember in the previous episode, I mentioned that I do not recall a single attempt to use that CB to call for help when we got stranded in Clarksville. So I asked her about that. She said, actually, I don't think it was Clarksville. I think it was Kentucky. And it was not. We had already crossed into Tennessee. She said if it was Clarksville, we wouldn't have been stranded for 3 hours. You don't realize that Clarksville is a pretty big area. Somebody would have spotted us and helped us out sooner. And I said, okay, that's fine, but why did you guys not use the CB? And she said, I don't think the car had a CB, or else we definitely would have used it. Kind of strange. I mean, I distinctly remember a CB being in that car, but hey, one person's memories versus somebody else's. And about Malicious Carp's comment about having poor quality MP3s ripped from CDs, and yeah, that is a thing. Yeah. And how many times have I heard of, and this isn't mentioned in Malicious Carp's feedback, but I can't tell you the number of times I've heard of people who just ripped the audio from their CDs and then got rid of the CDs, either sold them off or traded them or just plain put them in the garbage. And then what happens? A spectacular hard drive crash with no backups. All the music's gone. Yeah, seriously, keep your CDs, folks, because if nothing else, they're their own backup, really. And when you rip your music, you, if at all possible, rip it in a lossless format, like Apple Lossless or the more universal FLAC, free lossless audio codec. Lossless means that the digital sound is there without sacrificing any sound quality. Unlike, say, lossy formats such as MP3 or really any of the MPEG formats, whether it's MP3 or not. Because in order to make those files as small as they are, a sacrifice is made to some frequencies, and that can make a difference. Different people can tell MP3s from different frequencies or different bit rates, for example. I can tell an MP3 up to, what is it, 216, I think? I think that's what it is, 216. If you absolutely need MP3 compression and you want your audio to sound the best, you want to use probably 320 kilobits per second. That's the highest rate you can go. And of course, the beautiful thing about records is records are analog, so you don't even have that digital loss. It has its other trade-offs, as I mentioned in the previous episode, some of the disadvantages of records, but hey. And I totally hear you, Malicious Carp, about getting those albums you had as a kid, because I have several of the albums I had when I was a kid, and many of them, the actual records, not just repurchases I made years later. And I mentioned before how I was shocked at how good some of them sounded, despite how I didn't really take good care of my records when I was a little kid. storing them in a drawer stacked instead of storing them upright like you're supposed to. But hey, somehow they survived. So yeah, thanks again, Malicious Carp. And anyway, now that I have taken care of those goodies, as it were, let's take a look at this episode's feature, Reach by Richard Simmons. Reach was released on Elektra Records in the spring of 1982, around the same time as Jane Fonda's workout record, although Reach might have preceded it by a week or two. Now, I know that pretty much everybody listening knows who Richard Simmons is, but I do think a brief bio is warranted, and I want to get the bad stuff out of the way, and that is his death at age 76 on July 13th, 2024, literally the day after his birthday. From what I heard, the autopsy revealed that there was physical trauma to his head. According to his housekeeper, Simmons suffered a fall the previous day and hit his head in the bathroom. And upon being urged to go to the ER, get himself checked out, Richard refused, saying he did not want to spend his birthday in the hospital. Friends, please, as evidenced by Richard Simmons, Bob Saget, and possibly Billy Mays, for the love of God, or whomever you worship, if you do worship somebody, please, if you hit your head, get it checked out right away. Head injuries are pretty serious. But getting back to Richard Simmons, he was born July 12th, 1948, and his real name was Milton Teagle, Teagle Simmons. He was born in New Orleans, and according to his official website, and I quote, growing up in the French Quarter, where lard was a food group and dessert mandatory. Yeah, as somebody who's been to the French Quarter numerous times for vacation, yeah, if you're looking to watch your weight, trust me, New Orleans is not the place to go. And in fact, Richard had weight issues during his childhood. By the age of 4, he was overweight, and he was 182 pounds by the time he was 15, 268 pounds by the time he graduated from high school. He told people that he overate to get his parents' attention because he thought that they liked his older brother more. So Richard lived in Italy as a foreign exchange student, and he appeared in the films The Clowns and Satyricon, Satyricon. He had very small and very non-flattering roles. I know that you can see his appearance in Satyricon on YouTube, and I'll try to remember to link that in the show notes at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. So you're probably thinking, okay, so Richard was very overweight at one time, so what made him lose that weight? What made him make that decision? Well, it was a dark, rainy day, and he found an anonymous note on his car, and it said, "Dear Richard, you're very funny, but fat people die young. Please don't die." So that really got to him. So he responded by going on a crash diet, but he regained 65 pounds. Eventually, he did come up with a diet that would help him maintain a proper healthy weight. He then moved to Los Angeles in 1973, and he became the maitre d' at Derrick's in Beverly Hills. And as Richard focused on his fitness, he observed that existing exercise programs tended to favor people who were already in shape and just simply wanted to stay in shape rather than helping people who were not in very good shape and needed to get fit. So he consulted with various health experts, doctors, dietitians, etc., to come up with ways to develop fitness programs that were helpful to everybody, regardless of their situation. Obesity, elderly, young, physically challenged, you name it. So he opened an exercise studio in Beverly Hills, and he called it the Anatomy Asylum. And the goal was to provide a positive, supportive atmosphere that both made exercising fun and preached healthy eating, complete with a salad bar. Well, that salad bar went away when Richard decided to keep the focus on exercise, and he renamed the Anatomy Asylum to Slimmons, Slimmons. See what he did there? And he would teach fitness classes at Slimmons until 2013. But Slimmons was a huge success, and it caught the attention of a TV show called Real People. Fellow Gen Xers, you probably remember that weekly human interest show very well.
This is Richard Simmons, 134 pounds of fat-fighting fury, the Billy Graham and Sergeant Bilko of both. In Richard's crusade to get people to cut calories, he's as evangelical as any fundamentalist and as tough as any drill sergeant.
I want to see 25 of these, 10, 10, and 5. Stop complaining. You've got to go home with this body, not me. Now let's do them. Give me 10. 10.
And that exposure on real people brought nationwide attention to Richard Simmons. And that led him to appear on many, many TV shows and radio shows over the decades, including his own weekly TV show that lasted from 1980 until 1984. Yeah, I used to watch that when I was a little kid. I watched it all the time. Hard to believe because I was always fat, pretty much since the day I was born to this day. But I really liked the show. It was a fun watch. He had very silly comedy sketches in addition to his exercise segments. And by the way, among all those TV appearances that he made over the decades was a famous one when he was on The Late Show with David Letterman, and that was November 22nd, 2000, right around Thanksgiving, obviously, American Thanksgiving, which explains why Richard appeared on the show in a turkey costume. He ran over to hug Dave. The problem, though, in doing so, he absent-mindedly grabbed Letterman around the neck, which was a huge no-no because Dave had been in a really bad car accident that injured his neck, and he was very, very unforgiving about people who touched him on the neck. So Dave was ticked off. He was seriously ticked off, and he released a profanity-filled tirade while spraying Richard with a fire extinguisher in revenge. And the contents of that chemical-based fire extinguisher caused Richard to have a really bad asthma attack, which in turn pissed him off. So that incident sparked a feud that lasted several years. So Richard and Dave eventually buried the hatchet, and Richard showed up on The Late Show again in 2006, just days over 6 years after the original incident. But in addition to his TV appearances, Richard Simmons publishes programs over various media. You probably remember his home videos that he advertised, such as the famous Sweatin' to the Oldies, and of course the portion control programs such as Deal a Meal and Food Mover, which I believe were kind of along the lines of what Weight Watchers does, in which you're allowed to eat whatever you want, but you just have to watch how much of it you eat and keep track of it. In summary, really, Richard Simmons dedicated his life to helping people get fit and stay fit. It's estimated that he helped people shed a cumulative 3 million pounds over the years. Even on his last day on this earth, he was reaching out to his fans via email to give him moral support. I mean, yeah, back in the 80s, I would, like everybody else, kind of make fun of him because he was a quirky character like, say, Michael Jackson and Boy George. But man, you can't deny that he was a good person, a very good man. I don't want to comment on any speculation of what his, personal assistant or whatever might have done, keeping him out of the public eye and God knows what else, basically controlling him. I wasn't there. I don't know. And he always insisted he wasn't, but hey, who am I to say? All I know is he lived his life well, and his mission was to help people. And one of those ways he helped people was by releasing an exercise album. So let's focus on that for a bit.
Hi, my name is Richard Simmons, and Reach is my very first album. So turn on this music and tighten up that body. Lift it up, put it down, lift it up. Lift it up, put it down, lift it up.
Because this is an audio podcast, unless you're listening to this by watching YouTube, you won't necessarily have an idea of what the record looks like, so I'm going to describe it. The cover is a gatefold, and it shows Richard Simmons and dozens of people stretching or reaching. And the people on the cover are very diverse in gender, age, race, body types, and that was a Richard Simmons trademark, especially with his exercise videos. He'd put himself among a group of different people, different everything, especially different body types, to demonstrate how he believed that anybody could do the exercises that he recommended. The record contains mostly up-tempo songs like real rockers and maybe just a shade below rockers, and a couple of ballads, and they're all typical pop song length, and they sound very fitting for 1982, although not so dated as they're unlistenable today, at least in my opinion. I'll go through the tracks on the record. On side 1, you have a song called Wake Up, and because Richard Simmons also had a sense of humor, he starts it off with the sound of somebody snoring. And then there's kind of a Baba O'Reilly style rhythmic synthesizer riff, and then Richard yells at you to wake up and get your body in shape because you deserve it.
Good morning! Boy, am I gonna wake you up. Now listen, are you ready to bust your chops? Now come on. You know this is really the best way to start your day.
Then you have Don't Tell Me. That's another up-tempo song, and the lyrics are basically telling you that you have no excuse as to why you're not exercising, whether it be you didn't sleep last night, you don't think you can do the exercise, like it's beyond your ability or whatever.
Waist twists! Don't tell me that you can't do it right. Don't tell me that you stay up all night. Don't tell me that you say much. Don't tell
Next is Lift It Up, which sounds like something a hair band could have done, but with less intensity. And the lyrics warn you about eating high-calorie food too much, like candied yams and chili.
Mini sit-ups, not the hype for Sundays. And it's not the bowl of chips. It's not, you'll do it one day, you got to do it someday. You can. Lift it up.
And in case you forgot it was the 80s, the next track, Laugh, has a lot of saxophone on it, and the lyrics emphasize the importance of having a positive attitude. And side 1 ends with a mellow ballad called You Can Do It. What can you do? Well, first of all, you can take a break and lie down for a little bit because you've got the time. What else can you do? Take care of you, not just physically, but also mentally. Flip the record over, and of course you got side 2. What Are You Waiting For? That song picks the tempo back up, kind of a medium rock beat. It's got those generic get up off your butt and move kind of lyrics. Next song is the title track, Reach, which has a little bit of a disco vibe to it. Next you have Stop and Start, which is a bouncy little tune with lyrics that warn you about getting into this dreadful loop of, say, eating too much and then punishing yourself by either starving yourself or trying one of those unhealthy fad diets or pills or something. Live It is next, and that kind of mellows things down a little bit. And then the album closes with This Time, which I will talk about later on in this episode. Oh, and I should mention, in case it wasn't obvious, Richard Simmons sings on all of the tracks. They're all songs. And each track focuses on a specific set of exercises. He will tell you what exercises you're going to do at which time. He'll say, okay, now do these leg lifts at various times during the songs. And how do you know how to do those exercises? I'm so glad you asked. You know, because the album comes with a 20-page booklet that shows you how. Unfortunately, my copy does not have the 20-page booklet, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Interestingly, the record label writing credit says that all the songs were written by Bruce Roberts and Allie Willis, and, I quote, with Richard Simmons. I don't know what that means with Richard Simmons, like why he just didn't get an additional credit that didn't have the with on it. I'm guessing that maybe the songs themselves were written by Bruce and Allie, and then Richard just kind of chimes in with the spoken parts, like, okay, you can get up, you can do this, I believe in you, you should believe in you too, and whatever. And the lyrics, by the way, are overall very positive, very uplifting, and they're not condescending. I mean, sometimes the lyrics are about eating the wrong kinds of foods or unhealthy fad diets, but mainly as a warning against overdoing it rather than shaming. And an interesting fact, at least interesting according to me as a music fan, Steve Lukather from Toto, not really a fan, but I still think it's interesting. Steve plays guitar on 2 of the tracks, Don't Tell Me and Start and Stop. That's not the least bit surprising because as a general rule, if something was recorded in the 80s, chances are Steve Lukather was a session player on the recording. Also on the album is Lenny Castro, who also played with Toto, among other bands. and he plays percussion on most of the record. One other name worth noting here is Gary Coleman. No, not the short actor from Different Strokes, but the percussionist who was among a crowd of Hollywood musicians back in the day known as the Wrecking Crew or the Click or the First Call Gang, depending on whom you talk to. But Gary is on this record playing marimba and vibes on a couple of the tracks. The album was produced by a couple of very experienced and pretty well known in the industry folks, Dave Appel, Appell, and Hank Medress, I think it's pronounced Medress. And both together and apart, they produced many, many hit records going back to the 60s, if not earlier. There was one single released from the album, and that single was This Time on the A side with Reach on the B side. The single did not chart. And not only did the single not chart, but it was also featured in the book, The Worst Rock and Roll Records of All Time, A Fan's Guide to the Stuff You Love to Hate by Jimmy Guterman and Owen O'Donnell. That came out in 1991. That's actually how I first heard that Richard Simmons released music. And I was reading this when I was in college. I actually had it with me once, and somebody saw me with it and said, "Oh, that's interesting." And he looked at the cover and saw who wrote it. He said, "Oh my God, these guys don't know a thing about what they're talking about. This book, just don't believe a word that it says. Don't believe a word these guys say." I don't know about their reliability so much, so I'm just telling you what I was told by somebody I was in college with. Having said that, though, reading the book myself, it was pretty poorly researched, and a lot of things in there will tell you like, huh? But I don't want to get too much into that because I don't want to go too far off topic, because I'm going to go off topic again in a little bit. But it seems that their comments on This Time were just plain mean-spirited. For example, they put Richard Simmons in a category of television hucksters, as they said, along the same lines of all those televangelists that were asking for money back then. Yeah, they actually put him in that same category. They also said that in those days, people were more so interested in exercise to look good rather than to be healthy, which, from my recollections, that's probably a little bit true, probably true. But really, these guys were basically accusing Richard Simmons of using the record simply as a cash-in on himself and as a way to make himself more ubiquitous, what with his guest appearances on various TV shows at the time. And the thing is, in their write-up about the single, they didn't actually specify what exactly makes the song bad. So I don't know. I don't know. They might have written something in there, but it was edited out. I don't know. But it's still as controversial as I found that book. It's still an interesting read, and I do recommend picking it up if you're at a library or something. I also like to talk about how I got a hold of the records that I feature in this podcast. Well, my first job was at the Joliet Public Library, Joliet, Illinois. And I got that job when I was between sophomore and junior years of high school. And I stayed there for 7 years because I really loved that job. It wasn't a high-paying job at all, but I really enjoyed it. I loved the work, and I really loved the people. And a lot of the people that I worked with are still good friends to this day, 30 years later. And one day we were all notified, hey, there's a whole bunch of books and records and stuff in the basement that we deleted from the collection, or we decided not to add to the collection or put in the Friends of the Library sale. Feel free to take what you want. So a lot of us did. We hightailed it to the basement, and I went straight to the records, and I found a lot of really good stuff, like a very, very, very used copy of The Who Sell Out, which I still have in my collection. Other Voices by The Doors, which is the first album the band released after Jim Morrison quit the band. Yes, he quit the band. It wasn't his death that made him leave the band. In fact, they started recording the album before he died. And, another album that I found when I went through the library's rejected stash was, again, a highly used and circulated copy of Manassas, the self-titled Stephen Stills Manassas band's first album. And I grabbed it, and that was such a great album to listen to. I still love it. It's got several different genres. It's got bluegrass, blues, rock and roll. Great listen, especially if you're into, say, AOR classic rock. And the reason that I'm talking about this now, just seemingly way off topic, is what I remember that it's a double album. And in case you didn't notice, if you have a 2-record set, and especially if it's from the 70s, there is a good chance that one record will have sides 1 and 4, and the other record will have sides 2 and 3. That's what we call stacker format. That format was designed for people with stacking record players. That is, you put a stack of records on the turntable, you play the record. Once one record gets done, the next record on the stack drops, and the turntable automatically plays the next one. Repeat as many records as there are. The idea was you would take one record with side 1 facing up and the other record with side 2 facing up, put them on the stacker, and then what would happen? The record player would play side 1 all the way through, then the next record drops, and then it plays side 2 all the way through. When that's done, you pick up the records, just flip the stack over, and then side 3 plays, and then side 4 plays. That's why that happens. The thing about Manassas was, at least the copy that I had, sides 1 and 3 were on one record, and sides 2 and 4 were on the other. And that does not make any sense in that stacker format. And if you do not even have a stacker, if you're like me, you just have a 1-record turntable, which is what I recommend, by the way, you cannot change sides without changing records. And to me, that format does not make sense. Not terribly long ago, when I was playing the record, I realized there was a warp in one of the, I think it was record number 2, just in the outer edge of the vinyl, just in a portion of it, but it was so bad that the stylus was literally airborne. So I found another copy of Manassas that was perfectly flat. That was also formatted side 1 and 3 on one record, side 2 and 4 on the other record. And it blew my mind. I asked on Facebook, because I know a lot of friends of mine have a lot of old records, and there were a couple of people who said, let me check mine. Oh my God, you're right. That is weird. And the only thing I could think of that format is that if you're, say, an AOR radio DJ from the early 70s, and maybe you played albums all the way through nonstop, chances are your radio station had 2 turntables. So you could set up side 1 on one turntable and then side 2 on the other turntable. And as soon as side 1 is over, you could hit start on the other turntable with side 2. And while side 2 is playing, you could flip over side 1 to side 3 and then start side 3 seamlessly, and etc. And that's where I never saw another 2-record set like that since. I did hear from somebody that he has a copy of The Song Remains the Same by Led Zeppelin that's formatted that same way, and that's Atlantic Records, just like Manassas. Anyway, my friends, I'm sorry to go off on that tangent, but let me get back to how I got Reach. And you probably concluded that I found it in the library basement, and you'd be absolutely right. It was a deleted record from the library's collection, and that is probably why it does not have the 20-page booklet. Because what would happen when a public library had a record that had extra goodies? Either the library would take those extra goodies out because they get lost and just store them somewhere and forget about them, or maybe if it's substantial enough, it might be considered a separate item in the library collection. Like, for example, that 20-page booklet might have actually circulated as a separate book. Or they don't take the goodies out, but a patron who checks out the record keeps the goodies either accidentally or on purpose, and we get the record back without all the extra goodies. So that's one of those things happened with my copy of Reach, but I saw Reach in the library basement, and it still had all the stickers on it, like the library identification stickers and everything, and with a big stamp on it. I think it has the stamp on it. I have the record right here. Let me look at it. Let's see. Okay, yeah, it doesn't have the deleted stamp on it. It might have. Oh, actually, there's a label on here, something about exercise booklet with something, though that sticker was torn off, so I can't read there. So I guess this did have an exercise booklet at some point, and it circulated with the record, but it did not survive going to the library basement, sadly. But judging from the condition of the cover itself, this record must have circulated a lot at the Joliet Public Library. So if you didn't notice the picture of the record that accompanied the entry for this episode on the website, it is my copy from the library. But I saw that and I remembered the Jimmy Guterman, Owen O'Donnell book, and I thought, oh my God, it's that Richard Simmons record. So I had to have it. And confession, I never, ever, ever listened to it until I prepared for this episode. So I've been holding on to this thing for roughly 30 years before I finally played it. I did clean it. Don't worry about that. Yeah. Something that's been in a library basement for God knows how long. Definitely better clean that sucker before you try to play it. True story. Not long after I found that record, I befriended a guy on a BBS. If you don't know what a BBS is, just please look it up on Wikipedia. I don't want to have to explain that. And he was into record collecting. We would call each other from time to time and say, hey, what's up? And I told him that I have this Richard Simmons record. And he said, and I quote, just like this, "You're lying." Because he didn't think anybody would ever admit to having an album of Richard Simmons singing. Oh, God. Dennis, I haven't talked to you in almost 30 years, but if you're listening to this, I swear to God, I own this record. But anyway, having said all that, I talked about how I got the record, when the record came out, the production of the record, all that wonderful stuff. I should talk about how I am rating the record. But before we get into my ratings, I'm going to share with you Sean's record collecting thoughts. There is a Facebook group called I Know What I Have. The purpose of the group called I Know What I Have is to share for sale ads in which the seller is asking for an outrageously high price for something that should not cost a lot. That group name is taken from an expression that anybody who has ever been a collector of anything has heard from a vendor at a flea market, antique mall, or specialized resale store, such as a used record store. Sometimes you hear a variation of the phrase, such as, I know what these are worth. My advice to you, should you ever hear someone say that, put down any merchandise you are considering and walk out. Because someone who says, I know what I have, or any common variant of said phrase, is usually full of shamefully bad pricing habits. Aside from walking away from these vendors, there is at least one other way to combat the I know what I have syndrome. Inform yourself so that you know what they have. A lot of times you can use logic. For example, I don't care what anybody tries to tell you, there is almost no such thing as a rare Beatles record. Most Beatles records sold in the millions. One problem, though, is that the word Beatles will automatically jack up the price with many, many vendors. Age of the item might also inflate the price. Is the album Meet the Beatles rare? Well, some stores could not keep that thing stocked. As of December 26, 1991, the album was certified 5 times platinum by the RIAA. But of course, having said that, you also have to balance out how common the record is, which is very common, with condition. Think about who bought those first few runs of Meet the Beatles. Teenaged and preteen girls who would write their names on the covers and the records, kiss the cover, play the record ad infinitum on a cheap portable phonograph with a low-quality stylus that was probably at least twice as heavy as on today's better turntables, and God knows what else. So usually you should not be paying a lot for a vintage copy of Meet the Beatles, unless it is in unusually good condition. I remember one year at Beatlefest, I found a copy of Meet the Beatles for $12. Great, because I didn't have one yet. The cover was in good shape, and the record looked really good too. It was definitely used, but still in surprisingly decent shape. I was about to buy it until I saw that someone had written her name in ballpoint pen on the label. Oh, so I started to put the record back until my wife Lisa said, do you want the album for you yourself to enjoy, or are you thinking you might want to resell it later? I said, well, obviously I want it for my own enjoyment. So Lisa said, then who cares? Everything else looks good, and the only time you're ever going to see that writing is when you take the record out to play it. So just shut up and buy it, especially because that's a really good price. So, you know what I did? Yeah, I shut up and bought it. There are some legitimately rare Beatles records, though, but you kind of have to have the proper knowledge to know what is indeed rare. Case in point, Please Please Me album by the Beatles. Well, Please Please Me sold in the millions. But the original 1963 mono pressing with the gold type in the label, that is rare. You're going to be paying probably in the thousands for that if you ever happen across it. Chicago record label VJ Records released a lot of Beatles titles, usually the same content but different titles. But a great deal of what you'll see on the VJ label is counterfeit. For example, there was an album called Songs, Stories, and Pictures of the Fabulous Beatles. And it was in a gatefold cover, and it contained the record called Introducing the Beatles. So the label will say Introducing the Beatles, and it comes with a couple of other goodies. But you may see another album called Songs and Pictures of the Fabulous Beatles, and it's not in a gatefold. That is fake. If you see the actual Introducing the Beatles and the cover has a brown border, I promise you it's fake. Or at the very least, the cover is fake. It could have been that the record was swapped out with a real one, but the cover is fake. Or as some dealers will say, it's a reproduction. I've heard that one before. Basically, any musical album by the Beatles that is on VJ Records, the label is going to say Introducing the Beatles because they just repackaged the record in a different cover. That's normal. However, if you see one of those records and you see that the words The Beatles and then Introducing the Beatles are separated by the spindle hole, then it is fake. I don't care what the vendor's trying to tell you, what the seller's trying to tell you, it is fake. It's counterfeit. VJ albums have both the artist and the title name above the spindle hole. If the VJ label has kind of a rainbow stripe around it, make sure it has the color green in it. If it doesn't have green but has kind of a dull, almost brown tint where green should be, it's fake. One other way you can tell if an Introducing the Beatles is fake, look at the back cover. Assuming that the back cover has what's called the, I don't know if they call it the list variant or whatever, but basically if the back cover has the track listing, which most variants do, look at the song title, A Taste of Honey. Focus on the uprights of the letter H in honey. This is called the honey test. If the letter H is fully intact, it's probably legitimate. But if you see that there's a little tiny divot missing in one of those uprights on the H, put it back. It's fake, unless you don't mind having a fake, of course. If you see a stereo copy of Introducing the Beatles, be very suspicious because very, very few copies were ever made in stereo. The only way to be 100% sure that it's real is to actually play it and hear if it's truly in stereo. I don't think there are any known fake copies of the record itself if it plays back in stereo. All the fake stereos play back in mono. And again, make sure that the title and artist name, that both the phrase The Beatles and Introducing the Beatles are above the spindle hole. Any decent record store will let you listen before you buy. If that sucker plays back in stereo and the price isn't, say, in the thousands, buy it. Buy it, buy it, buy it. Of course, the good news is with the stereo Introducing the Beatles, the cover is usually of really poor quality. It's all faded and crap, so it's pretty obvious that it's fake. How about that copy of Elvis's Moody Blue album on blue vinyl that's in your parents' collection, and you think it's collectible because it's on blue vinyl? Well, probably not, and I'll tell you why. Most copies of Moody Blue, including most reissues, are on blue vinyl. If you want one that's truly collectible, look for a second pressing on black vinyl. The black vinyl versions are hard to find, believe it or not. And also kind of going back to what I said before, use logic. Elvis records sold a lot, especially Moody Blue. Why Moody Blue in particular? Because that was the album that was out when he died. You better believe that when he died, people flocked to the record store and bought his current album. Either my parents or maybe my brother during his brief Elvis phase had it, and I was fascinated that the record was blue. I mean, who ever heard of a non-black record? I mean, I was 3, maybe 4 years old when that album was out, and I had not yet learned the facts of life when it comes to records. But the thing is, a blue, moody blue is not rare. The black copy is the rare one. And another one of my favorite findings was at a record show that my wife Lisa and I used to go to in Edison, New Jersey. And there was a vendor offering up a copy of the Monkees' third album, Headquarters. And there was a note on it that said, Rare Beards Cover. In case you're not familiar with the album, the back cover of Headquarters has a few pictures of the Monkees during the recording sessions for the album. There are 2 different versions. One version has one of the pictures, there's 2 of them, I think. And another version, there's a picture that includes Peter Tork, Mickey Dolenz, Mike Nesmith, and their producer at the time, Chip Douglas. And the caption identified them as Peter Tork, Mike Nesmith, Mickey Dolenz, and Douglas Farthing Hatlalid, or however you pronounce it. That's Chip Douglas's actual name. And in that picture, the Monkees, the 3 Monkees in that picture, all have facial hair. They have beards, which is rare. It was very rare to see a picture of any of those guys with beards until probably the 70s. The belief was that after the album was released, the powers that be decided that Monkees fans would have been put off by a picture of 3 of the Monkees with beards. So they recalled the cover and put on a new cover that didn't have bearded monkeys on it. Well, the truth is it was the other way around. The cover that came out on the first issue had the picture with no beards on it. But the problem was the caption did not match the picture. They actually used the wrong picture. And when that mistake was realized, that's when the cover was pulled back and they stuck on the picture with the beards. So the beards picture is actually the more common one. But no matter what, Headquarters, just like, say, Meet the Beatles and Moody Blue, sold a crap ton of copies. It was a #1 hit, and no variation of Headquarters is hard to find, whether it be the Beards version or the not Beards version. But basically what I'm trying to tell you is keep yourself informed. Now, when Lisa and I happened upon that laughable Rare Beards cover note on the Monkees album, this was before smartphones were a thing. But thankfully, we were big enough fans that we happened to know that there was nothing rare about that particular variation. But nowadays, now that we all have smartphones, or most of us have smartphones, that should no longer be an issue. If someone tries to sell you something for a lot higher price than what you think it should be, or makes a claim about some kind of rarity on an item that logically should not be rare, do yourself a favor and open up a web browser on your smartphone and use your favorite search engine to see what people say about how rare that particular item is, or if there perhaps is a variation on it that legitimately is rare. Also, Discogs.com can help you out a little bit with that as well, especially if you're looking for a very particular variation in which you might have to match up, say, the matrix numbers etched or stamped into the runout. Of course, aside from being informed about what you're buying, well, you also have to keep in mind, what is it that you actually want to buy? Do you want something that's necessarily collectible, or are you looking more to buy something because you want it to sound good? If it's just the sound, that might open up the possibilities for you because you can just inspect the vinyl and make sure it's clean. And also maybe you could do a quick search and see what people say, how good that particular pressing sounds. Again, Discogs.com might help with that because there are a lot of reviews on that site. Or maybe you just want to frame the album cover and use it as a decoration. Then, of course, hey, it doesn't matter what shape the vinyl is in, just as long as the cover is decent enough for you. Or maybe you just want that title so you can have it. So, of course, all of that should come into play when you're wondering what you're actually looking at. Probably my most recent I know what I have occurrence was a few years ago when I went to a record store in Evanston, Illinois, just on the north border of Chicago. That store had been around for quite a long time, years if not decades. So I figured, hey, they've been around forever, they're probably reliable. Well, I couldn't find a single album that was priced under $30. I mean, yeah, in some instances that's to be expected. Like if it's a reissue on the Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab label, then yeah, that's going to be an expensive purchase. And in fact, $30 would be quite a bargain. And it's not uncommon for brand new pressings to be expensive these days, especially if the record was pressed overseas. Most brand new pressings these days are made in Czech Republic, and the better ones are made in Germany. But trust me, most of these records in this store were very used, nothing special, and should not have been $30 for a one-disc album. I mean, heck, I got a really good condition 1973 copy of Quadrophenia, complete with the libretto intact, at Laurie's Planet of Sound in Chicago for $12. Plus, most of the Beatles records at that Evanston place I talked about, they were bootlegs that had extractions from the Beatles Rock Band video game. As I was flipping through records in that store and taking records out of the racks to get a closer look at the covers, the guy behind the counter said, "Be careful, those are expensive." Yeah, no kidding, because you have them priced so friggin' high. Needless to say, I left that store empty-handed. But this whole "I know what I have" thing, what does that phrase actually mean? From my observation, it means one of the following. It could mean, when my son moved out of the house in 1983, he left his records behind, and when I asked him what to do with them, he said, "I don't care, sell them, throw them out, do whatever. And because they're records, they're collectible, so I'm going to charge a hefty price for them." Usually this example of "I know what I have" means that there's a lot of ringware on the cover. Another common meaning of "I know what I have" is this. "I looked up the price of this album in a price guide, found what a first pressing in mint condition is worth, and priced every copy I have of this title according to that first pressing mint condition price." Yeah, and if you try to point out how the record is obviously not mint, the vendor will, on the spot, try to redefine what mint actually means. "Oh, that fingerprint came from whoever handled the record at the factory." Yeah, sure. But really, the broad definition of "I know what I have" is, you're going to need more than a $20 bill if you want to buy a record from me. The biggest red flag in record shopping, or really shopping for any other kind of collectible, is when a vendor says, "I know what I have." As a reminder to those of you who've been listening to this podcast in the past, and it's also an FYI for you new listeners of this podcast, I rate each record that I talk about on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive, each on 5 factors. And that means that each record will have a cumulative score of somewhere between 5 and 25 inclusive. First, I rate based on local interest or usefulness. That is, depending on what the contents of the record are. If there's some specific local interest involved, then I rate based on that. Otherwise, I rate based on usefulness. I also take into account historical interest. Is the record an interesting sign of its time, perhaps? And I also rate records on their uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability. Now, reach does not have any specific locale involved, so definitely the first rating will be usefulness. Unfortunately, I cannot comment from personal experience about how useful the record is. I can speculate based on my own observations of the purpose of the record, how well it's put together, and comments from those who have used the album. When Reach came out, exercise books, records, and tapes were pretty popular. Home video, I don't know, it was still pretty much in its infancy, but workout videos would soon become popular as well. And because video wasn't really the most common form of exercise instruction at the time, but it would soon be, you had to choose among audio recordings, books, TV shows, and in-person instruction. The beauty of having a record, or its equivalent tape, I suppose, is that you can listen to it pretty much whenever you want at your own pace. Guterman and O'Donnell, in that book about the worst rock and roll records of all time, they did bring up one good point, though, when they discussed the Richard Simmons record. What do you do if the record skips and you're stuck in a loop of, well, as they put it, lifting your rear end above your eyebrows? But besides that, the 20-page booklet that comes with the album is certainly a helper because it shows you how to do the exercises that Richard Simmons is calling out periodically during the course of the songs. But to get a more concrete idea of how useful the record is, I went to what I thought would be a good source, the comments sections of YouTube videos. And this is, I think, the only time I've ever found the comments section of anything to ever be useful. Sorry for the editorializing. I gotta tell you though, I was pleasantly surprised. Overall, the comments on the tracks from the Reach album are pretty positive. From what I gather, if you worked out with the entire album every day or almost every day, you would see gradual improvement in your body and health. Gradual, by the way, is a good thing. Any doctor or weight loss expert is going to tell you that you only want to lose a little bit at a time. You don't want to lose a lot of weight too fast. Some comments even mentioned how the record was actually used in their PE classes, and believe it or not, they had fun with it. Keeping in mind that exercising with a record, for various reasons, is not the most ideal way to get healthy, but also balancing that out with the positives, I'd have to rate Reach a 4 for usefulness. How about historical interest? The record indeed is a relic of the early 80s, and everything about it screams 1982. The music sounds like it's from 1982, and it came out when Richard Simmons was absolutely exploding in popularity. And that it's an exercise album, and exercise albums were huge in the 80s. One cannot deny the historical value of Reach. The recent, as of this recording, and unexpected death of Richard Simmons sadly makes this record even more of a history piece. With all this in mind, I will rate the historical interest factor of Reach a 4. Next, let me talk about the uniqueness. Again, this is an exercise record. Exercise records were massively popular in the 80s, and that includes Reach. The album peaked at number 44 during its 40-week run on the Billboard 200 chart, and that's pretty dang good for a workout record. It was certified platinum on July 12, 1982, pretty shortly after its release. That means that at the very least, 1 million copies of the album sold, and in a very short time to boot. So is the record unique? In my opinion, no, not at all. So for uniqueness, I rate Reach a 1. Now, friends, this podcast is about weird records, so Natch, I have to rate based on weirdness. And this is when we see how I see uniqueness and weirdness as completely different and unrelated qualities. Yeah, the album is not unique. It's common. It's easy to find. It sold platinum and it charted well. It's on a mainstream label by a mainstream artist. But here's the thing. Richard Simmons was an energetic, flamboyant fitness guru. That was his bag. What was he not? A singer. And the contents of the album, even though it's an exercise album, Richard does far more singing than he does speaking. So just the fact that this is an album of Richard Simmons singing is enough of a reason to rate the album high on the weirdness factor. Am I going to go all the way to 5 on this? Well, no, for one and only one reason. Even though Richard Simmons was not a singer, he actually could carry a tune, and occasionally on the album, he sings surprisingly well.
You can do it. You can do it if you try.
If he was never a trained singer in his life, I would not be the least bit surprised if he at least took voice lessons to prepare for the album. I admit when you first drop the needle and you hear him start singing, it's very jarring because, well, it's Richard Simmons and he's singing. And sometimes he sounds kind of like Squiggy, but seriously, he's not half bad. So I'll rate the weirdness a 4, not a 5. As for enjoyability, well, personally, all I could rely on, given that I only have the record in the sleeve and not the all-important 20-page booklet, was what comes out of the speakers. Personally, I find most of the album quite enjoyable. Yes, put the record on and it's instantly 1982, but I don't mean that in a bad way. The production is pretty good and the songs are actually catchy. It sounds like Simmons was having a lot of fun doing it too. To get a more rounded rating, once again, I went to the YouTube comments, again, which were overall very positive. So many people commented about how much fun they had with the album. I again ask the rhetorical question, am I going to go all the way to 5 with the rating here? Again, I say no. Remember, I said most of the album is quite enjoyable. There are 2 ballads on the album, one of which seems to have a specific purpose. Side 1's closer, You Can Do It, is a mellow ballad that starts off with a spoken message from Simmons telling you that you worked hard so far and you deserve a rest. And that kind of implies that the song serves to give you a bit of a breather. When I was taking notes while I listened to the record, when I heard You Can Do It, the first thing I wrote down was that he was singing, and I quote, shockingly well. The other ballad, however, This Time, honestly, I do not blame Guterman and O'Donnell for including it among the worst rock and roll records of all time. It's just too bad they didn't say exactly what specifically was wrong with it. But, friends, the song is bad. Embarrassingly bad. Cringingly bad.
And this time, you can love the hurt away of all the times you've tried. 'Cause in your heart, you're here to stay. It's for you.
If you've never heard the Reach album and want to give it a listen, skip This Time. If you're in a used record store and you see a copy of This Time in the singles section, go a tab or 2 back in the section from Richard Simmons to Gene Simmons. You'll be glad you did. Did Gene Simmons have any singles? I don't know. Anyway, This Time knocks the record from what could have been a 5 for enjoyability down to 4. So to recap, my friends, I rated Reach as follows: 4 for usefulness, 4 for historical interest, 1 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 4 for enjoyability. Add up those ratings and you get a composite of 17 out of 25, meaning that the album is tied with the record we looked at in the last episode, Everything You Need to Know to Operate a CB Radio. So, I guess I have to break the tie. Usually my tiebreaker is this: if I had to choose one of these records to listen to at any given time, which am I likely to go to first? I'm a music guy. I love music. So chances are I'll reach, pardon the pun, for the music-oriented Richard Simmons album rather than the spoken word CB record. So, my friends, that was everything I could tell you about Reach by the late, great Richard Simmons. Do you have any thoughts on this album or anything else relevant to this podcast? Well, before I tell you about next month's episode, I will tell you how you can send me your thoughts, and I will give credit where credit is due. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com, and Fab4it is spelled FAB, the number 4, IT. The webpage, by the way, for this podcast, including each episode's show notes, has a URL that's very similar to my email address. It's the same thing, except there's a dot instead of an @ sign. So that is myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. You can reach out to me on the various social networks where my handle is myweirdrecords. I finally got my Hive account set up, by the way, so you can reach me there. You can look for this podcast on Facebook. Simply do a search for My Weird Record Collection or go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. The podcast can also be accessed on YouTube, where you'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records I discuss and occasional bonus videos concerning both my weird and my not so weird record collections. Just search for My Weird Record Collection or go directly to youtube.com/My Weird Record Collection. I should also mention that sounds and music used in this podcast belong to their respective copyright holders and are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. Special thanks to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, for letting me use his record The Pac-Man EP as the basis for the logo for this podcast. Tim and his unique, amazing music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Special thanks also goes out to my buddy Kevin Zerb for designing the logo artwork for this podcast. Kevin and his music and his podcasts are available on the web at zerbinator.com. Next month for episode 9. Put on your Sunday best, kids. We're going to Sears. Until then, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store. Bye-bye.
Do they sell jewelry bags?
Now, some of you have small ones, and some of you have big ones, and it doesn't make any difference. You want firm ones.
Not just physically, but also menting. Menting? No.
Well, boy, do I have something for you.
And his real name was Milton Teagle, Teagel.